Okay, well, my name is Kirk Durston, and I'm going to be kind of the facilitator or MC of a podcast series that Michael Horner will be doing. I am a philosopher, and I've taken great interest in Michael's work over the years. So it just seemed natural for me to be the person to interview him on this whole podcast series. Today, we're going to be kind of like a preview or an interview overview. And if you hear him making some claims that I'm sure you might think at first are outrageous, then just hang in there. That's what the rest of the series is about. But a little bit about Michael himself. Michael has been presenting a reasonable case for Christianity on university campuses around the world for about the past 50 years. He has been serving with Power to Change, and he's participated in over 80 public formal debates and dialogues, delivered hundreds of lectures, and hosted Q&A with literally thousands of students. Michael holds a graduate degree in philosophy from the University of Toronto, and for 20 years helped shape the worldview of Christian students as an instructor in philosophy and ethical issues at Trinity Western University and Summit Pacific College. Mr. Horner is also a contributing author to the recent book, Everyday Apologetics, and has numerous articles and videos online at thelife.com and on YouTube. A little bit about Michael's personal life. He loves playing and coaching basketball, and having played for the University of Calgary back in the day, he has also coached young men at Trinity Western University, Columbia Bible College, and several high schools, and numerous summer camps and clubs. Unfortunately, he's not able to play the game he loves anymore, and he's found a replacement for his fitness and competitive needs in the sport of pickleball. Michael is married. They have 3 children and 7 grandchildren. And with that little snapshot of Michael Horner, who I would sum up as a Christian philosopher, a thinker, and very interesting to listen to, let's begin today's discussion. And it has to do with just when you look at how Christianity is regarded in today's Western culture, it tends to not be very positive, despite the fact that Michael is going to show it has had an enormous positive influence in this world. So the question is, how did we get here? And so why don't we start with that question, Michael? Maybe just review a little bit your perspective of how Christianity is seen today, and maybe launch us into the how do we get here bit.
Right. Well, the question, how did we get here, is the question I was asking myself. And of course, a lot of people are asking that question these days about our culture. How did our culture get to where it is? I mean, a lot of the ideas that people seem to hold to just seem to have gone exponentially over the line in the view of a lot of us, I think. And we wonder, well, how did people arrive at these types of thoughts? And I had 15 years ago begun reading some history, especially history of Christianity, by the sociologist Rodney Stark, who is an interesting character, who was an agnostic. And yet, as he began researching the history of Christianity and its social impact, he was so amazed by the positive social impact of Christianity that he actually became a Christian. Now, I think he just passed away in the last year. But then, more recently, I've been noticing some things that Stark had said were true, which is that people tend to believe a lot of negative things about our current culture right now, and actually have believed negative things about Christianity as being the sort of foundation of that culture. We've believed negative things about Christianity for a few hundred years now. And there are a number of sort of myths, what I call cultural myths, or you might want to just call them falsehoods or lies, that our culture tends to believe, that I think may very well be built upon one major falsehood, one major myth or lie, and that is the idea that Christianity is harmful to human flourishing. And so it led me to begin reading other people on this, on the history of Christianity and its social impact, and to begin to answer the question, how did people come to this belief that Christianity is the problem? It needs to be marginalized, maybe even exterminated. Uh, and I want to know, how did they come to this position? And I think Stark
Well,
helped me, but others have helped even further.
yeah, that's a very good question. I know just when I interact with people myself on university campuses across this country, I am astounded by not just the things they believe, but when I ask them, why do you believe this? That's a whole interesting, like Alice in Wonderland type of world. Why we believe these things that we do, or why our culture does. And for many, it's if they just hear it repeated often enough, they actually begin to think it's true. But I understand from your research, though, that there is kind of like a starting point in how people came to think that Christianity is harmful. And so, why don't you expand on that a bit? It has to do with this so-called Dark Ages.
Exactly. Most people are familiar with the term the Dark Ages, and I think this concept that initially began in the early Renaissance period was picked up on by Protestants, ironically and unfortunately, and exaggerated this idea that the previous millennium under the Roman Catholic Church had just been completely the Dark Ages, just barbarism, ignorance, uh, torture. Like there was nothing good that came out of the previous thousand years.
So you're saying the Protestants actually had a hand in this
Yeah, this is
by exaggerating things to try and make the Catholic Church look bad.
look, it's human nature, right? If you're if
It's,
you're in a disagreement with somebody, you tend to want to make your opponent look really bad, and I'm afraid Protestants gave into the temptation to
yeah,
exaggerate. I mean, don't get me wrong, there was very good reasons for the Reformation. Very strong reasons. The church needed to be reformed. But to think that nothing good happened in the previous 1,000 years, that it was completely the Dark Ages, is just an exaggeration. And it's not true. And we will have a look at that as we're moving through a series here. In fact, what we're talking about right now is the beginning of a series of questions. The series that we're going to look at will, first of all, try to deal with how did we get here? But then we're going to move to the second question that we're already touching on. How is it that people did come to believe the Dark Ages? And we're beginning, and we're just giving little snippets right now, because the next point is the Enlightenment thinkers, in particular the Enlightenment atheists, picked up on this Dark Ages metaphor or motif and built upon it, calling their era the Age of Enlightenment. Light in contrast to the
yeah.
darkness that was there before. And so we'll try to answer that question, how the Dark Ages kind of became an Enlightenment narrative. And my suggestion is that this has been with us and is part of the answer to the initial question, how did we get here? Well, it's this Dark Ages narrative that kind of set the foundation for everything that's happened in the last 300 years or so.
Now, if you ask, let's say, an average person on the street today, what their impression of Christianity is, and it tends to be negative, and you ask them uh, why, they might not necessarily say the phrase "Dark Ages," but they might refer to some things that are supposed to have happened in the Dark Ages. That maybe the Protestants exaggerated, maybe the atheist Enlightenment thinkers kind of played off on. So it's not just a matter of the Dark Ages, this myth that nothing good happened, but isn't there also some idea that there was some bad things happening during the Dark Ages, and these bad things tend to be what people focus on today?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. My research began to show, first of all, that there was amazing positive social impact during the so-called Dark Ages. And in fact, most historians do not use that term Dark Ages anymore. There's a widespread consensus that the Dark Ages concept was a myth. Even the major encyclopedias now don't use that term and call the term a myth. But I couldn't help but notice, despite all the tremendous progress actually that laid the groundwork for much of the positive things that have happened since the Enlightenment time up till now, there were still some really egregious, serious blemishes. And I wrestled with it because I really struggle with the idea of how could a genuine Christian, an authentic Christian, it's a term that you and I like to use, right? Authentic Christianity. How could an authentic Christian, that is someone who actually has the Holy Spirit living inside of them, be involved in some of the terrible things that had happened? Crusades, inquisitions, witch trials, the Galileo affair, and even more recent things that people point to, even in our own era right now, where it seems that people who call themselves Christians are doing some horrible things. Now, one answer is, well, they weren't Christians. I think that is true in some cases. These are people who weren't actual Christians, maybe Christians in name only. But I was not able to draw that conclusion in every case. There was too much egregious behavior. And so it took me a year as I wrestled through that. And so I want to say up front the answer to the question, but Christians have done horrible things, right? Isn't that good enough reason for us to say Christianity is harmful to human flourishing? And my answer is going to be yes, horrible things have been done by genuine Christians, but no, that's not an adequate reason to judge that the teachings of Jesus, which is what Christianity is harmful to human flourishing.
That's a very good point, Michael. I noticed quite often when I've been talking, say, with a particular student at university who begins to say, gives me their reason for rejecting Christianity, and he points to some horrific thing, some terrible thing that people who identified as Christians, whether rightly or not, it's difficult for us to know, but identified as Christians did. And my question to them is, well, is that what Jesus taught? And then I just wait because I want to know what they will say about that. And every time, I have never had an exception to this. Every time they, after a moment of thought, they say, well, no, that's not what Jesus taught. But there's the problem, the difference, as you've just pointed out, between what Jesus taught and what people who follow him, whether falsely or truly, do. And we need to distinguish those two things.
Right. In addition to that, the failures of Christians to consistently live up to the teachings of Jesus actually confirms one of the key Christian doctrines, one of the key principles that was part of Jesus's teaching and Jesus's worldview, which is that human beings are all flawed. We are so flawed that we are in need of a savior. And that's why Jesus said he came to seek and save the lost. We're flawed, we're lost. And so even the bad behavior of the Christians just confirms that when people say, well, Christianity's done horrible things and Christians have done bad things, then I would say, well, compared to what? Compared to what? If you compare it to the ancient pagan religions, out of which that time period Christianity grew, compared to those ancient pagan religions, the impact of Christianity was so positive. And the fact is, again, all human beings are flawed. And so the real problem that the answer to this question leads to is not that the problem is this particular religion or that particular religion. The problem is you and me and every human being. It's the human heart. This fallenness of us. And one thing that really hit me, one of the authors that I was reading recently is Glenn Scrivener. His book called "The Air We Breathe" is another book that covers some of the this history of Christianity critically, but very insightfully. And he points out that the parables that Jesus taught about the kingdom and how Jesus's kingdom would grow and expand, those parables point out that it would start very small but become very, very large in the end or towards the end. Well, right now, Christianity is the largest worldview that has ever existed. He also said it would be growth would be very, very gradual, like yeast in a very large piece of dough, the original parable talked about, but it would eventually spread through the entire large piece of dough, and that represents our world. And Christianity has spread, and it's not just the numbers, but it's the not just the quantity, but it's the quality of it, of what has spread as well. He said also that there would be the wheat and the weeds would grow up together within the church. So the good and the bad would be present, and he would sort it out at the end, not to worry about it. And then he also said the gates of hell will not stand up against the expansion of his kingdom. So that made me look at the last 2,000 years quite differently, because the atheist critique, Marx, for example, a current atheist thinker, A.C. Grayling, they emphasize, look, Christianity, you've had 2,000 years, and you haven't done a great job. You haven't changed the world to this in any sort of utopian sense, or contributed to human flourishing enough. It's time for you guys, Christians, get out of the way and let the revolution happen and take over. But in light of Jesus's parables, you know what? The kingdom that Jesus talked about has been growing exactly as he said it would. So the growth has been started small, it's become very large. Started very slow and gradual, and that's the key point. It's gradually growing with all sorts of hiccups, ups and downs. It's kind of like the stock market. Keep your money in the market. There's going to be ups and downs, your financial advisor says, but if you keep it in the market, eventually it's going to go up. And I think that's what the kingdom of God has kind of been doing, despite the flaws, despite the blemishes and the mistakes. God's plan.
You've made a very important point here. In fact, a couple of them, Michael, that I just want to kind of recap to emphasize.
Yeah.
And the first thing is your phrase, Christianity has, or the accusation against Christianity, that hasn't been all that everybody was hoping it would be, or assumes that it would be by this point. And you say, compared to what? And that is a very important question to ask. And I think we're going to dive a lot deeper into that when we come to that episode. But that is a question that needs to be asked, compared to what? And when we look at that, then we see that, well, it's actually phenomenally positive when you compare it to some of the other things that have happened even in the last century with atheistic regimes. The other thing that you've raised is that we are flawed, that we have a human nature. And I remarkably, I see some resistance in the academic world, at least, to believing that we have a human nature that has issues, that has flaws. And there's a real tendency to try and blame our environment for whatever flaws we have. And if we can just fix the environment, then we'll all be wonderful, singing Kumbaya and so forth. We're going to dive into that later on as well.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. those are two major things. We won't get into the details now, but
Yeah,
so
that's a good summary.
what is the positive? Like we've talked about some of the negative stuff here. What about a preview or a couple of hints about what we're going to be talking about as far as the positive things that Christianity has done? You've started by saying that slowly, it never was the plan to explode and do everything in one year, but throughout history, and history is slowly culminating. So, what have you got to say about that?
Well, probably the key issue, it's maybe two key issues that I think Christianity really changed the Western world in, and that was our view of human beings. And that actually is based on our view of God. The Christian God is very different than the pagan gods. The Christian God was an intelligent God of reason and love and mercy, who actually desired a personal relationship with the human beings that he's created. I mean, that was such a contrast to the capricious gods of the Roman and Greek pantheon that there's just no comparison. They're more like a 14-year-old juvenile delinquents than anything
Well,
else.
now that you mentioned that, Mike, I'll remember the Euthyphro dialogue with Socrates having a conversation with Euthyphro, and they're trying to figure out what makes something good. And the Euthyphro says, "Well, it's what the gods like," but Socrates says, "But the gods quarrel amongst themselves about what they like," and it's kind of what you just described here.
Yeah.
These would be the Greek gods.
So that image of God was significantly different and better, more positive image than the pagan view. And then the image of human beings was changed because human beings, according to Jewish and Christian thinking, were created in the image of that intelligent, reasonable, loving, merciful God. And that provides a basis now for equal human value, worth, and dignity, from which flow equal rights. And that took time for that leaven to work its way through. But around the 11th to 12th centuries, that began to show up in Christian teaching, long before the Enlightenment. The second major category is reason itself. Christianity is actually a religion of reason. Rodney Stark's one of his books, and it's the key point he emphasizes, is he calls it the victory of reason. And of course, all we hear today is that Christianity is just all about faith, and they define faith in some sense as the opposite of reason. None of that is true. That's not the biblical understanding of faith. It's certainly not the Christian understanding of faith. Christianity is a religion of reason because it's an intelligent God who has made us also intelligent. And that laid the foundation for education. Universities came into existence in the so-called Dark Ages, and science. We're going to see later on that science didn't just pop into existence out of nowhere, in the 18th century. No, it was a continual growth, a curve of growth of understanding and application of reason. All the early Enlightenment scientists were religious people. The non-religious people were more the literary people of the Enlightenment, and they tend to be atheistic, agnostic, and they kind of came up with this myth that science just kind of popped into existence, and they only went back as far as Galileo and Boyle and Newton, and there was nothing before that. Well, not true. Galileo just didn't pop into existence out of nothing with whole new ideas. It was built on previous thinking, and he was he thought there needed to be a change in what Aristotle thought, and he was right. And we'll get into that whole Galileo affair because there's a lot of myth
Yeah.
involved with
Well,
that.
the point that you made that Christianity promotes reason, I've just recently been in discussions with that as well. And one of the things that we are asked to do by God is to be able to give a well-reasoned defense for the things that we believe. But it's and if you want to see what that's like, it's Plato's dialogue Apologia, where Socrates defends himself in court. It's like a reasoned defense. But the other thing that strikes me is that in the Bible, it also says that when a person drifts away from God, one of the casualties of that is they become more and more like an unreasoning animal, a person who does no longer reason, but just basically believes the things they want to believe, which is, I would say, a problem with our culture today, that it's
Yes.
more weighted towards believing what they want to believe as opposed to a well-reasoned logical progression that arrives at conclusions.
Yeah, good point. And once we kind of get more specifically talking about our current culture, we'll get to that because that's a very good point.
Mhm.
So what I found is the evidence was quite overwhelming to me, but it's not just me. There are lots of scholars. Um, Tom Holland is a perfect example. He's basically a secular humanist uh, who loved the idea of the leaders of the Romans and the Greeks, and he thought that they were just the kind of the standard from which his values came from as a modern secular humanist. And he went and did historical research into this and actually was just appalled at the behavior of the Greeks and the Romans, the Spartans. They were just brutal. And he came to the conclusion after studying the social impact of Christianity that everything that he believes and cherishes as a secular humanist, the values, actually owe their existence to Christianity. So his book called Dominion, and I forget what the subtitle is. It's different in the UK than it is in the United States and Canada. But Dominion by Tom Holland, 700 pages, is a wonderful, wonderful read. Another scholar, historian by the name of John Dixon, Bullies and Saints, study of the social impact of Christianity, pulls no punches. There were bullies within Christianity, but there were also saints. So despite the egregious behavior of some, he draws the same conclusion as Holland that, and this is the point I guess I want to make right at this point in this interview here, is that the evidence is that Christianity is the most positively transformational worldview in the history of the human race.
Okay, and I can see the listener right there just thinking
Yeah,
that's outrageous.
yeah,
But the whole point of this is to whet your appetite, because Michael, you're going to really dive into this and defend that actually from history, not just for some smoke and mirrors, but actually the track record of history. You're going to go into this more deeply.
right. So just to review, we started with the question, how did we get here? The next question was, well, how did people come to think that Christianity is harmful to human flourishing? And the answer was, well, this Dark Ages and Enlightenment narrative of the Dark Ages. And then we had to take a sidetrack. What about the serious blemishes in Christianity? And we see that, well, yes, there were serious bad things done by Christians, but that doesn't mean that the teachings of Jesus themselves are not good. And then the evidence I'm claiming so it shows that that Christianity is the most positively transformational worldview. So now the next question is, well, what if Christianity really is the most positively transformational ideology in the history of the world for human flourishing? Now, even if you don't agree with that right now, I just want you to ask yourself the question, what if that were true? What should the implications be? What should the implications be for Christians to realize that this is true? What should the implications be for a non-believer of Christianity to realize this is true. Like Tom Holland. Tom Holland is not converted to Christianity. I think he calls himself maybe a moral Christian at this point because he realizes his morality is based on Christianity, but he hasn't theologically converted. So how should an unbeliever respond if this is really true?
Yeah, that's a practical application of this whole thing. So that's not just an academic discussion we're having, but the implications could be enormous, not just for culture and not just for the future, but for me as an individual, for each one of us as individuals.
That's right. It's both personal and collective, the potential implications here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's not going to be an easy thing for people who've been brought up in our culture since the Enlightenment to answer this question. What are the implications? Because we've been taught a certain way. The very air we breathe is not only saturated with the values of Christianity, but it's also saturated with the sort of the anti-Christianity of the Enlightenment. And that's still part of the answering our original question: how did we get here? That give and take has been going on for a few hundred years now, and it's not an easy thing to ask yourself. If you're an unbeliever, what if Christianity really is powerfully transformational, and all the things that we cherish in our Western culture, the things for which people in other cultures are striving for, and why they want to move to the West, in spite of the fact the West is not perfect, there's still so many wonderful values that seem to not have been present in other parts of history.
Okay, if the values that we enjoy in our society today, and maybe we'll get to that further. There's a problem, though, in our society as I see some of these values being eroded now. But we'll probably talk more about that when that episode comes. But if the values that we really cherish today in our society owe their existence to Christianity, then how is it that they seem to have been twisted into something that's the opposite of what Jesus Christ taught?
That was the next question that troubled me. Clearly, some of the values that our culture believes right now are contrary to Christian teaching, and yet some of them seem to be based on Christian teaching, and they just have a slight twist to it. So all of a sudden, it's almost anti-Christian now. How did this happen? That's getting closer to answering the original question: how did we get here now? And I have a phrase that I don't know if I doubt it's original with me. I probably read it somewhere, but fruit without the root, I think, is part of the answer. That is, the Enlightenment thinkers, whether they were consciously aware of it or not, were adopting Christian values, like the idea of the equal value, worth, and dignity of every human being, and human rights is the key example. But they did not want to adopt the Christian doctrines that undergirded those views. So they wanted the fruit of Christian values, but they did not want the root that the fruit relied upon. And so I've just started an analysis of looking at each at particular roots that the Enlightenment thinkers sort of took the hatchet to and cut out. Things like, first of all, the obvious one is just God. God's existence, and with that, the existence of the supernatural or not. And you can see how cutting out one of those roots gradually begins to erode other things. And a really good analysis is done by Carl Trueman. He basically shows, starting with Rousseau, and then the Romantics, which I always thought it's a great title for a rock group. Rousseau and the Romantics. uh, of the 18th and 19th centuries. The first thing they focused on was this root belief that we have a human nature that is flawed, and they didn't like the idea of it being flawed. Didn't like the idea of it being evil, and so they suggested that there is a human nature, but it's not flawed. Children aren't born evil. I mean, at worst, it's maybe a blank slate, but it's innocent maybe at best. And in our natural state, human beings are good, and it's from the outside, the institutions from the outside that bring sadness and badness to human beings.
Yeah, well, it's
What
I
you
guess that
mentioned
does raise the
earlier.
question is like, what are these institutions made up out of if they're not made of human beings? Like, are we just looking at the collective outcome of human nature when we start looking at institutions and governments and media and whatever else that we claim? I mean, it seems that it's difficult to blame one's environment if in fact it's other people that have shaped that environment, and then we have to go, well, what shaped them? And it's
Good point.
I guess if
Yeah.
we live in a world that denies that there's a flaw in our human nature, it gets to be a lot of creative storytelling we have to do in order to just kind of like stick our head in the sand and avoid that.
Yeah, I agree. I think so. And so then Truman's analysis moves on to Darwin and Marx and Nietzsche, who basically deny that there is a human nature. So the Rousseau and the Romantics said there's a human nature, but it's not bad. And then the next group actually denies there's a human nature. And then that's followed by Freud, who says since there is no human nature, all we really have to work with is pleasure or pain to figure out what is good, and what leads to human happiness, and what brings the most pleasure: genital sex, as far as Freud's concerned. And so then sex becomes a focal point of the human being, but there's no human nature. It's just pleasure or pain. And then after that comes cultural Marxism, as the Marxists realize that the economic focus is not going to work in producing revolution, because the capitalist economies are actually treating the proletariat quite well, and they're doing quite well under capitalism, and they aren't going to want to revolt against it. So cultural Marxism just says, okay, we're going to have to find some other grounds for initiating the revolution among the people. And the story of that is the story of the 20th century, from the 1920s and 30s onward, and even up until now, which the sexual revolution of the 60s, and then the more recent development of postmodernism, which really affected people's understanding of truth, or whether we can actually access truth. And then finally, the for lack of a better descriptive term, the woke ideology, which is built upon both cultural Marxism and postmodernism, which leads to a lot of the things right now that people are really many people are scratching their heads about and thinking, well, how in the world could people think like that? So that's kind of where we're heading in answering that question, and it's an interesting journey.
Yeah, well, you've said a lot of things that are absolutely fascinating, and I hope that I know we're going to be able to dive into all of this much more deeply in a series of episodes that really focus on these things. So at the face of it, some of the things you said, I know people would think, well, that's just outrageous. But the whole point of this series is to get you to think, is to get people to think more carefully and to be able to critically think about what they believe and how they came to believe this, and what actually might be the best thing that has ever happened to humanity. And again, I'll say another outrageous thing here, but it's actually the effect of authentic Christianity, the actual teachings of Jesus here. And history shows that. And that's what you're going to dive into.
Right. It just may very well be that the teachings of Jesus are not the main problem for human flourishing, but just might be the main solution. And I want people to consider that and wrestle with it, and in light of the evidence of history.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's I can hardly wait till we get into these episodes, Michael, because I've got a hint just talking with you other times that there's a lot more can be said on each one of these points.
Well, I've enjoyed just researching this whole thing. It's been exciting. It's been difficult. I've had to ask tough questions, but it's been truly enlightening.
Well, should we wrap it up there, Michael, or is there any closing
Yeah.
statement you'd like to make? That's good.
No, I think that's it. My closing statement was
Yep.
Jesus may very well not be the problem, but the solution. And
Yeah, I like that.
let's have a look at that.
That's a nice, concise way of wrapping it all up. So if you've been intrigued by what Michael and I have been talking about, or what mainly Michael has been introducing and putting on the table here, with this brief preview or overview, or if you've been outraged, that's great. Tune in for our next podcast in this series of podcasts we're going to do that we've just basically summarized today. So for now, bye. And Michael, it's been a pleasure to hear what you're tempting us with as far as these ideas.
Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.